Hello and welcome to Aston Originals. Today we are talking about the January transfer window, sustainability in football too. I'm joined today by Dr. Johan Rewilak and Dr. Danny Fitzpatrick. Johan, I know you've been on the channel before, but if you want to just introduce yourself very quickly.
So I'm Dr. Johan Rewilak. I'm an academic here at Aston University, and my research focuses on development finance and sports economics and finance.
Perfect. And Danny?
Danny Fitzpatrick. I'm a lecturer in politics and international relations here at Aston. Part of my research looks at the politics and governance of sport, particularly on football.
Perfect. Okay. Johan, I'll start with you, and we've got actually like a spider diagram to talk through it. I don't know if people are maybe going to be able to see this, but if you could just give us sort of like a round robin of what's going on here.
So we've got a January transfer window starting here, and the thing to look at here is what's probably going to happen here. Is there going to be increased turnover? There's been rumours of certain clubs wanting to sell their players and get some high earners off the books, and what will effectively happen in a few weeks' time. So the big one to look at is these new agent restrictions that are going to come in July the 1st, 2022. So this January transfer window will be the only window where there's an opportunity for agents to get a larger percentage of a commission from transfer fees and player wages, which have now been benchmarked at a certain percentage. So currently, agents operating above this kind of limit may be very keen to get their players moving this January transfer window. And as a result, this could be an increased turnaround of players come January. Likewise, as well, there's been players in Barcelona rumoured to be put on the transfer market. Frankie de Jong, Dest and Ter Stegen are notable players here. One aspect in terms of football finance here is that Barcelona's financial model, we already know how indebted the club are, but their revenue model is highly determinant on their success. And one of those measures of that success was reaching the latter stages of the Champions League. We know that they've been knocked out and currently are going to be in the Europa competition. Therefore, there's a pressing need for them to maybe move some players on. Whether or not these players will actually end up moving in January or not is something that we'll find out very shortly.
Johan, do you think that the market value of those players in Barcelona is going to be lower than what Barcelona want because teams know that Barcelona are in this financial situation?
Absolutely. I think that in terms for players in Barcelona, other clubs know Barcelona need to be a selling club here. Otherwise, they may be in financial difficulty. Therefore, they may decide to put in lower offers than the actual worth of certain players. That is certainly the case. But then again, Barcelona, if they still have the rights to these players, they're under no obligation to sell. So they may decide to say, we're going to stick with this price and we're not going to allow a player to leave unless we get this market value that we determined. Because as we've seen, even though they are highly indebted, they still manage to get players signed on come summer, including Sergio Aguero, who's unfortunately retired recently with heart problems.
Danny, a couple of months is a long time in football. It certainly is in 2020, 2021. It wasn't that long ago that we were talking about the potential of a European Super League. Barcelona, obviously, was one of the clubs that was behind that. We've had the fan-led review in this country. It came out early this year. So could you just talk us a little bit through this and how the transfer window may be impacted by it, or future ones maybe?
Yeah, so I think part of the motivation for the review in the first place, obviously a lot of the problems it looks at are long-standing, and some of those are connected to the transfer market and the ever kind of spiralling costs of football transfers and associated costs, particularly wages. I think the context of COVID was the major driver of the review. That's what made it more urgent. And then together with that, as you say, the proposed European Super League just kind of added greater urgency to it. I think it makes a number of different potentially transformative proposals, and I've got certain reservations about it, but I do think as a football fan, first and foremost, it is a positive report. It is a potentially radical report. So the biggest proposal it makes and how that could affect football transfers is the introduction of a independent regulator. So football, to all intents and purposes, let's talk about in terms of the English context for a moment. Football has ran itself as a private club since it was founded in the late 19th century. And that kind of worked up until a point for a long time. There was some written and kind of unwritten rules on solidarity, and they kind of have been eroded over the last 30 to 40 years and have been rapidly eroded as more money has come into football. So the kind of current system of private self-regulation, I think, has been shown demonstrably not to work. And I think football transfers are one example, maybe the most notable example of that. So in the report, it notes football, the transfer costs and wages of players account for about 73% of turnover in the Premier League. Outside of the top six, the top six most wealthy clubs who consistently qualify for the Champions League, I think it's higher than that. It's around 87%. In the Championship, it's 120% of turnover. So you don't need to be an expert, you don't need to be an economist or an expert on football finances to know intuitively if you're spending 120% of what you earn, and that is not sustainable. So what football's tried to do, financial fair play, hasn't worked or hasn't gone far enough. So an independent regulator does certainly open the door for more financial sustainability in the future. What is yet to be seen is kind of how the rules are enforced and what the regulator can do and is prepared to do. That's obviously an unknown. But I think in terms of kind of setting some new rules of the game to protect the game almost from itself, and to remove some of the perverse incentives from within football, that is the kind of the biggest potential impact that review could have on the future of football and its viability, I think.
We talk about sustainability in football quite a lot, don't we, Johan? And, realistically, probably the top 23 teams in England are probably going to be okay. There seems to be a lot of yo-yo clubs at the moment, people like Norwich, West Bromwich Albion, who are up and down, but always there or thereabouts. So have that access to quick cash, if you like. Is something like sustainability of football really only there because of those lower league clubs that have tended to disappear over the last few years? I mean, Bury, one of the more recent ones that have fallen foul of it. And when you think a team like Manchester City and the check that they cut when they broke the financial fair play rules would have kept teams like Bury in business for God knows how many years.
Well, it's very interesting here, and you may want to go back all the way up to the Bosman ruling where players could now actually leave for free. So prior to that, money was remaining in the game. So ignoring the labour restrictions that we had imposed here, assuming that a player could not leave their previous club, even though the end of their contract had been expired. So similar to what we had in baseball as the reserve clause in MLB, it still meant that you'd have to pay a fee to acquire a player from an opposing team. And this still meant that there was money left in the game. So as you mentioned with Manchester City, if they wanted to purchase a player from a lower league and he was out of contract, rather than just stripping him and taking him away for zero, they'd have to pay some money for that player. And then that money would be circulated within the lower divisions. For example, if that money went to, say, Bolton could then maybe potentially purchase several players of their own, and that money would then circulate and cycle around the lower leagues and so forth. So there's certainly a big help. So there is this trade-off in terms of that we've got this European law, which I completely agree with in the sense that players should be able to be mobile. But in my mind, there's some kind of compensation that's needed because as we've seen witnessed recently, when players do sign for free transfers, what typically happens to their wages? Their wages are normally inflated. and also what happens to player agents. Player agents are very happy to take a little bit more commission from there. So the surplus actually actually goes away from the game into players and agents' pockets, so that money doesn't return back into the club. So Manchester United, when they signed Alexis Sanchez, as you see at the bottom of the bar there, he was paid £560,000 a week. That money came out of the game, and Alexis Sanchez probably spent it on, I don't know, maybe buying a new piano or some luxury.
Get a few pianos for that. Where are you shopping for your pianos? I think it works out, it's going along the bottom of the screen, about £29,000 a touch. So it's just not very good value, is it?
Absolutely not. And this is where the financial distress may come in. And Danny touched upon this, about 120% of turnover is how much we're paying for player costs in that division. When we look at these things called Z scores that look at whether firms are going to be bankruptcy risk in the Championship, from some academic research that's currently in progress, we've seen that there's actually the average club is a bankruptcy risk in the Championship, which has severe consequences.
And Danny, I suppose this is a little bit of a balancing act, and actually probably quite a big one for the bodies within football to deal with at the moment. We talk about, tax, expenditure and all that sort of thing. And I think with becoming economical with your tax, you're looking for tax loopholes as well, potentially. Do you think a regulator would help in getting a system in place where teams can't take advantage of it just because they are the richest clubs in the country?
Yeah, certainly. I was listening to a conversation about the Championship on the radio at the weekend, and they were talking about, I think it was Rotherham, and how Rotherham are a relatively well-run club. And I think, as I say, there's some strange, perverse incentives within football where clubs which are well-run, who spend within their means, who are financially resilient, who protect the viability of the club going into the future, there's a ceiling on those clubs, because they will not be prepared to spend to put the club at risk. And I think, it's a classic kind of problem in economics. The rewards are huge within football. So to get in the Premier League there's a massive financial kind of treasure chest there. To get in the Champions League, it's the same. And the actual consequences of overspending, even going into administration, there's a moral hazard, and the consequences are they're not particularly great, because for most part the clubs will survive in some form. The owners can leave and become owners elsewhere. We talked about Bury, but the likes of Bury and Macclesfield and Rushden and Diamonds, clubs that have actually been liquidated, there's very few examples of them. Most clubs kind of bounce back and come back in another form. So obviously, we don't want clubs being wound up and ceasing to exist altogether. So if we don't want that, if we do need to protect the clubs, then we need to kind of incentivize owners and incentivize clubs to manage them in a more sustainable fashion. That's the fundamental thing, and I think a regulator can do that. It can level the playing field for those owners and those clubs who are doing the right things, and I think that is fundamentally what it's about and what the role of the regulator should be.
And in terms of a regulator becoming a success, I suppose you've got to win over fans and also the clubs themselves, because I guess you don't want to end up with a FIFA 2.0, do you?
Well, I think the fans that's an easy audience, because fan groups have been calling for this for decades. I don't think there's a great deal of goodwill for the FA. The FA are ostensibly the governing body of the game, but they have no power and they've failed a number of occasions. So I think from the fans' perspective, I think it would generally be welcomed. The clubs, obviously, as we've seen by the reactions and some of the rhetoric from some of the chief executives of particularly Premier League clubs, it isn't particularly welcome. And that's interesting to reflect on that. Why? Well, I say traditionally they've been able to regulate themselves. I suppose generally businesses will resist any type of regulation because it generally makes the people's job harder, because they've got to answer, they've got to be accountable to someone else. But I think that's just a question of, it fundamentally comes down to a question of political will. And if government is willing to back it, publicly and privately, then it will happen. So it's, how important is it? The current government's made all the right noises in terms of supporting the proposals, but we'll wait and see. Kind of the devil's in the detail with these things. But to my mind, I would look and think, within the report, what do the clubs really have a problem with, and what are they really resisting? And in some ways, that resistance is revealing in itself. I think some of the problems that football's got itself into is that it's attracted the wrong kind of people who've been attracted to football because there is no regulation, rather than other areas of business. So, that in itself, I think, tells us a lot.
Speaking of which, Newcastle United, that purchase has been a very big talking point, hasn't it? Ever since it happened, and even in what seemed like years in the making. Johan, do you think? I mean, Danny was mentioned there about well-run clubs, and I think from the outside looking in, you have to say now with the state of financial fair play and how much Newcastle would actually be allowed to spend before they broke any rules. Actually, Mike Ashley has probably done Newcastle a huge favour, hasn't he, in the way that he's run the club previously.
If you're speaking to a Newcastle fan, he'll probably say, or she'll probably say, no, that's not the case. We're so glad that Mike Ashley has left the club. But you look at Newcastle United, have they been in a bankruptcy risk or bankruptcy situation, even though they've been relegated? Parachute payments and all those kind of things aside, has there been a moment where Newcastle United were in financial distress or close to financial distress? I'm probably going to say no, they weren't. And they have spent money on players. Okay, maybe not the correct type of players that Newcastle fans wanted to see, ones that really improved them on the pitch, but they have spent a lot of money during the Mike Ashley era on players. Okay, and whilst again, it's all a relative situation where if somebody's spending £60 million on a player and you're only spending £20 million, of course you're going to look worse off to your fans. But in a situation there, have Newcastle been paying or spending what they can afford? I'd probably agree so. I'd probably agree that they would. Now, am I unhappy that Mike Ashley is no longer Newcastle United owner? Well, you can look at it swings and roundabouts, but personally, you probably look at it and say that Newcastle United were run relatively well to a certain extent. Whilst they've got new owners now who can spend whatever they like to a certain degree, almost like Manchester City could spend freely, we must be aware that there has been some legislation recently passed from the other Premier League clubs trying to limit the amount of money that can come in through sponsorship to these clubs in order to inflate their spending. So we've noticed that firms or sponsors linked to political regimes overinflate the value of certain sponsorships. And I'm going to put Danny in the spotlight here because we've had a situation with Everton as well, where the owner for the new stadium, there was a company that paid for the rights just to have the name of that stadium. So the option to name that stadium gifted Everton a huge sum of money. And that option never has to be excised. So these little clever dealings are ways that people can try and get around it. Whether Newcastle United now will try and do that in future, well, we'll wait and see. But personally, I think Mike Ashley, even though he's had a lot of bad press, I never think that Newcastle United were ever a financial risk.
Johan, they weren't clever enough though, because we still ended up with Solomon Rondon up front. So financial fair play has still come to haunt us.
I mean, yeah, we were joking beforehand. Obviously, for full disclosure, Danny is an Everton fan. Johan is a Manchester United fan. I'm a Wolves fan. But we were saying that Everton have this ability to completely ruin players. I mean, that's just no good as a sustainable model, is it, Danny?
Yeah, it's just, I think, as we were saying before, it's just an example and a case study of how an influx of money, unless you've got essentially unlimited supply of petrodollars like Manchester City have, even when you get a billionaire owner like Farhad Moshiri, there's still a cap on what can be spent. And Everton were always operating, not at the very top echelons of the transfer market, probably that rung or two rungs below. And you can waste a lot of money when you're kind of involved in those type of transfers. all, like you say, not to go into kind of Everton's misdemeanors and problems too much, but virtually none of the players they've bought have had any resale value since Rewilak Lukaku. You haven't made any, not only made any money, the players that they've bought, they've ended up selling for next to nothing. So I think it's interesting. You know, you used to talk about buying, a club like Everton especially would talk about buying players, and you would think about the potential resale value for that player. I think now it's not even in a consideration because the wages again are the biggest problem. It's not actually the transfer fees. So, you know, when Everton bought James Rodriguez, you know, an absolutely kind of world star of football, he was a free transfer, but his wages were so high that they were forced to sell him, or reportedly forced to sell him at the start of the season. So it's to me, it's the wages which are the major problem, which really do need to kind of be curbed and some kind of form of regulation put on them. I suppose that the problem is, it's like with financial fair play, you can devise a system of rules to enhance the sustainability, but generally that will, you know, look to kind of apply a portion of a club's revenue that they can spend on wages or transfers, but then that may set in, you know, reinforce the existing inequalities. And you know, there's a different conversation about whether you try and equalise, you know, the situation between clubs. I think that is much more difficult to achieve, and will definitely be resisted, obviously, by the bigger clubs, considering they want to leave to, you know, to form a new league to actually exacerbate those current inequalities. So, yeah, I think lots of things to kind of discuss in the future in terms of what the regulator might do.
Yeah, and what was it, up to 34 million for Alex Iwobi? Ouch.
Yeah, that's it. Let's not go there.
And just to finish off on a note of predictions and stuff, I mean, here we can see the sort of like the top 5 of contracts ending in 2022. There's some big names in there, isn't there, Johan? Mbappe is at the top of the list, obviously worth an incredible amount of money. His market value there is 144 million. He's only 22 years old. He's obviously a World Cup winner with France. PSG don't really seem to do it in the European leagues at the moment. Obviously, domestically, they're very good. Do you think this is going to be a big transfer window? Do you think clubs will be paying a lot of money for the caliber of these players? Obviously, one of your guys there, Paul Pogba, is on the list as well. But with coronavirus, I mean, I think probably this time last year we thought we were going to be saying goodbye to it in 2021. It hasn't been the case. Do you think clubs are going to be a little bit more reserved, or do you think actually this is going to be worth a gamble to get one of what is the world's top talent?
I think the coronavirus hangover is still going to be prevalent, personally. I do think, though, that recently we've signed a new broadcast deal. Well, the Premier League has signed a new broadcast deal in the United States, where there's going to be a lot more money coming in. So as broadcast deals keep increasing in value, it just seems to lead to this kind of transfer window inflation, or where the total amount of spends always is on this kind of ever-increasing spectrum, in particular towards the top end. The interesting thing, what you showed there, was these kind of transfer market values of these players. Now, what we know, and it's kind of fitting what Danny touched upon it, that it's not the transfer fees that are the problem now for many clubs, it's actually the wages they pay. That even though Mbappe is worth 144 million euros or pounds or whatever it is on there, he's actually worth 0 come July. So how it appears in clubs' financial statements is that a player's value, or how much they paid for that player, is amortized throughout the period of their contract. So using Paul Pogba as an example, signed for £90 million almost 6 years ago. If Manchester United amortises value, and they use straight line depreciation to do that, or straight line amortization to do that, currently his value in January is only £7.5 million because it's done equally through each kind of year. So whilst it's £54 million there, Manchester United's books would have Paul Pogba's value down as £7.5 million, which will eventually be 0 come summer. And let's assume that the market value is there, what the player is worth, or their marginal revenue product. Then that £54 million, because Paul Pogba is leaving for free, could be what the premium another club would be happy to pay for Paul Pogba. So they say to themselves, well, he's worth £54 million. we don't have to pay £54 million for it, so let's split this profit. Paul Pogba's wages suddenly go up by £27 million. The other teammates are £27 million surplus who sign him. But that has some longer-term repercussions because Paul Pogba, assuming this isn't his last contract, do you think he's wanting his salary to go down by a huge, significant amount? And who'll be able to afford him there on after? And that's the problem with a few of these players, some of these big nameplates in particular, and their mobility at the moment is that there's only a subset of clubs that can currently afford the high demands that they're willing to ask for.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm Sam. I was just going to say, I think Johan's right. I think the conversation for a long time on football transfers was, and I think it's now you can see it's a misnomer, is that there's going to be the broadcast deals have peaked, audience figures are declining, and the bubble will burst, and that will kind of correct the distortion in transfer fees. And although I think that there is something within that, obviously. Part of the European Super League was driven by, trends in kind of how audiences view football and a desire to respond to that, and I worry about what would happen to broadcasting in the future. But I think the other thing as well, the last 20 years is the rise of other leagues which, on sporting terms, aren't as strong, but financially have provided other places for players to go and command big wages. The MLS originally, and then obviously China and Qatar. I don't want to, they haven't distorted the market as such, but I think that is another big factor which increases that inflationary pressure on the kind of the more traditional dominant European leagues as well, and makes it more difficult for those leagues to kind of be sustainable on a national basis.
A question for both of you. I mean, Danny, you mentioned it there that you think that the bubble will burst eventually. And obviously that's based on the model of Sky, BT and other, what I would call old media broadcasters having a stronghold on the rights for Premier League football. But it wasn't that long ago. I think it may have been this year or maybe the back end of last year when it was looking at whether people thought that somebody like Amazon could come in and make a huge network, which could be global. It could be affordable for everybody. If you attach it onto your Prime membership, you can have every single game of Premier League football. You can do that in the United States at the moment, can't you? You can buy a TV package. I think it works out at $40 a month and you can have every single game of Premier League football. Do you think that won't come in before the bubble bursts, or do you think it will just increase the bubble demonstrably, and then we could see wages like some of the top baseball players, for example, are on?
Yeah, you may be better placed to answer this than me. I don't see the bubble bursting any time soon, because although I think the narrative in this country that Sky has obviously been a huge success and has changed certainly English football. I think. About 1982, I think English football was only being shown, certainly in Norway, maybe Denmark, and it was worth about £500,000 in 1982. Compare that today, and you're kind of talking in the billions. So obviously, the landscape is being transformed. But I still think, and you touched on there, the kind of the on-demand platforms like Amazon becoming more involved. I think could have an even bigger impact. I feel that there's a lot of untapped potential there because the particular business model of Sky was quite, for lots of people, it was prohibitively expensive. It wasn't cheap to do, and therefore it was deemed that the market, I think about 10 years ago, was saturated. Sky had as many customers as it could have because those were the people who wanted to watch football that much had already bought it. I think, in hindsight, that was probably a little bit short-sighted. So I don't really see the bubble bursting kind of in the short term, the next decade to 2 decades. But obviously, the viewing habits of younger people, younger fans are changing. And I think it's more of a question of how that will impact on the sport, not just how the sport's marketed, but also what the sport tries to do to appeal to that broadcast market. I think that's potentially the bigger question.
Johan, can I bring you in on that one as well?
Of course, yeah. I think Danny's probably hit the nail on the head there. That I think for the short to medium term, I can't really see the bubble bursting. I think it's going to be some kind of disruption or some longer term disruptions of how viewing habits change, which will lead to a burst in this bubble. One thing to note as well is look at the United States. If you say what's the most popular game in the United States, they'll say American football. However, if you're looking at young children at school nowadays, more participate in association football than American football. So that's just kind of just saying that this demand actually for the next generation maybe even become larger or on a larger scale as association football steals customers from other markets such as American football, potentially baseball, hockey and so forth. So I think in the short to medium term, I can't see the bubble bursting, which actually in terms of financial distress is actually really good, especially given that there's a few clubs in Italy whose models or financial models were built on purchasing players, and Danny touched upon it earlier on, purchasing a player, waiting for the inflation boom of transfer fees to increase, and then selling the player, almost kind of like a housing market bubble. So buying and then waiting for the inflationary pressures, selling the player and using that profit to recapitalise the football club. Inter Milan were obviously a prime candidate here when they signed Romelu Lukaku, hoping that in 2 years when we sell him, that we create a lot more value from him, and that can make sure the club stays financially sustainable in the next few years. So it's probably a good job that the bubble doesn't burst imminently. It takes a bit of a longer approach. So rather than being cold turkey, it goes down to be a bit more measured, a bit more managed to allow that clubs won't suddenly have a big drop in their finances and their revenues, however they adopt their models, and they've got time to change them.
Yeah,
I love how. Sorry, Danny. I just love, Johan, how you would not call it soccer then, and it was you're never going to say soccer, and I completely respect you for that. Danny, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I think the reason why I don't think it's going to burst is for the same reason, and it's more pronounced now in 2021 than it was in the late 1980s. The same reason why Sky were willing to pay so much more than ITV for the rights, the domestic rights to show English football, and then what became the Premier League in 1992, was because it dragged people in, and it was appointment viewing. And now, 30 years later, that is even more the case because, apart from football and major other sporting events, what other live TV to people watch? It's virtually nothing. So I think in terms of the kind of the rationale for the broadcasters, it's not that football has receded in importance socially or culturally. It's much more pronounced. So I just can't see, I say, in the next decade at least, that kind of changing really.
I think I'm going to stick up for Sky here because nobody ever seems to do that, because Sky didn't say to any clubs in the Premier League, you have to go and spend all of this money we're giving you on the players. That's been a club decision. And so, I mean, Johan, shouldn't clubs start taking responsibility for the situation that we are in now?
You could argue, yes. So you've got these kind of different motives behind football clubs in terms of profit maximising or win maximising. Profit maximisation is normally in these North American sports, whilst win maximisation is typically in our European leagues. Those owners or even supporters crave success. If they don't have success, there's only one team that can be successful every year, can be the pinnacle of English football, win that Premier League. So by definition, you're going to have you have 19 unhappy clubs in the Premier League, you're going to have 24 unhappy in the Championship and so forth, all filtering all the way down to the divisions. Therefore, the pressure from fans on chief executives and owners to invest in a title-winning squad or a squad that's going to be performing well is huge pressure. And having spoken to a few owners of football clubs, they decided not to roll the dice and, as Danny's mentioned, be responsible owners. And the hate they've received from fans for adopting that decision, it really makes them think, is it worth this? Should we just roll the dice and see what happens? Because it's going to keep the fans quiet. And if it goes badly, then I'll just run away.
Yeah,
it's someone else's problem.
Excellent points in there. I just want to end on a prediction. So probably a little bit outside what we were talking about in the beginning, but probably more attached to what we've spoken to since, is that obviously we've had 30 years of the Premier League. The landscape has changed massively over those 3 decades. But firstly to you, Danny, do you think esports will be bigger than football in the next 30 years?
Wrong person to ask because I don't really have much interest in esports, but I think they'll certainly get bigger. I think what you'll probably see, certainly in some sports, obviously F1 seems to be the most obvious example, is the lines between what is classed as a, quote unquote, proper sport and what is an esport will become more blurred and less obvious, and there will be kind of movement between them. For football,
so FIFA versus football, I suppose.
Yeah. I can't see it, but maybe I'm just not the visionary that the world of esports needs to take them forth into this brave new world. But I certainly think you'll see more of it, and you can just very anecdotally, you can already see it in terms of even the things, the program that the BBC puts on, with their kind of what's it called, MOTDX, what do you mean, Janice? Yeah. There's lots of things which are esports related, and even this current generation of footballers tend to be more kind of keen kind of gamers involved in that world. So I don't see it as a kind of a separation and necessarily a competition. I think you'll see big sporting brands cotton onto the fact and bring it into the fold and kind of colonise esports, if anything. That'd be my prediction.
Johan, do you think people will be watching the World Cup final in 2050, or will they be watching some esports on the moon sponsored by Elon Musk?
I will put it out in this way and leave it very philosophical answer to the end. So 20, 30 years ago, if you watched football and enjoyed football, you'd buy a computer game to play football. I'm starting to see or believe the behaviours are more that I play FIFA and now I decide to watch association football because I'm used to playing as Mbappe, so I'm going to turn on and watch Paris Saint-Germain potentially play to see what Mbappe does in real life. So I'm going to leave it philosophically just like that.
Well, there you go. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody. Really good insight into that, actually, and only time will tell, I suppose. But like I say, things seem to happen very, very quickly in the world of football. So I guess we won't have to wait too long for an answer to those questions. But we'll say goodbye to Dr. Danny Fitzpatrick, Dr. Johan Rewilak, and it is a goodbye from me. Goodbye.
Cheers. Yeah.